Firstly, Yang Berhormat Tuan Muhammad Rafizi Ramli, Minister of Economy. Yang Berhormat Nik Nazmi, Nik Ahmad, Minister of, we won't call it NREC, we will call it NRECC, a big supporter. And another former May banker, Chairman Suranjaya Tenaga. Welcome, Danny, and welcome, gentlemen. Now, I haven't downloaded it, but I actually have the document. No, I only received it. So what I would like to do, and I think we are filled to capacity. And so for those of you that are standing at the back, our thanks. But what we're really seeing, my ministers, not my ministers, but my ministers, is the excitement of the capital market of a just transition and the roadmap that we are outlaying, because it is catalytic. And since, I'll probably ask a few questions about part 2 that's going to be launched in August later, if I may, but working my right to left or left to right, Nazmi, what can you share with us? What are your initial thoughts around part 1 of the energy transition?
Okay, thank you.
Because it is bold, it is exciting, and it is all those things we were promised, catalytic, it's got granularity, there's 10 high impact projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we've seen what we've tried to do since the new government has come into power in December 2022, I can say that the energy sector has been one of the parts of government that has been moving quite fast. Early on, we started with the journey towards targeted subsidies, and that has continued. It has a life of its own by now that fortunately it's created less anger and backlash after we did the very difficult parts in the beginning. Then I think it was in May when Saudara Rafizi and I, we spoke about renewable energy trading for the region to capitalize on our position at the center of ASEAN, which Rafizi mentioned just now, and this long spoken vision of an ASEAN power grid. So, and at the same time, what we've done, along with the shift towards targeted subsidies, is also to relax on the various policies on solar. For example, previously, if you are a high voltage user, you're not allowed to have SALCO, self-consumption, for solar. Now we've allowed it. For households, for the NEM Rakyat program, there's basically no limit to what solar you can install. So with that as the background, what has been launched in this, I don't know, is NETR, not NETR. NETR, okay. So what has been launched under NETR, the Energy Transition Roadmap, I think has been something which is quite refreshing, because now it's the next stage. We've been in power for more than half a year. People want to see big, tangible projects where, which can encapsulate the vision of energy transition for the country. We have a lot of potential, immense potential, which I think we have not really fulfilled, and it's important that we can embark on that path as we want to realize our goal of achieving net zero earliest by 2050. That's how I see it. But for that vision, which to me is centered on climate change, but for that vision to work, the economics have to work. So I think this is where the economics of it comes in to push through that transition.
Well, thanks, Ravi. Well, if you bear with me, I'm going to go to Danny because you've had the floor for a little while. Danny, thoughts?
Sure. I'll just take on the economic imperative that YB Rafizi mentioned earlier in his speech. And, given that we have capital market investors globally as well today, I'd just like to share with everyone here that this NETR or NETR approach is actually necessary for us to be part of that global economy. So I'm taking excerpts from the World Energy Transition Outlook report by IRENA. IRENA already did the METO on the Malaysian Energy Transition Outlook, but they've also done a global one. So for example, in 2022, last year, their capacity plant up globally was 300 gigawatt, and 83% of that is renewable. But out of that 83%, out of that renewable mix, 3/4 was only concentrated on 3 countries, which is US, China, and EU, 3 regions. So YB Rafizi and YB Nick are absolutely right to say that we need to then take leadership in this part of the world to do the same. Irina then extends that outlook to go all the way to 2050. They predict that by that year, generation would have tripled. Total generation will be 90 petawatt hour. 1 petawatt hour is equivalent to 1 million gigawatt hour. That's how large it is. But the interesting statistic out of their report is that 91% will be renewable. 91%, that's the whole world. So in that sort of backdrop, our goals is necessary. We have to do this. We need to be part of that global transition as well, as part of our national transition. But I do believe if you look at all the other regional companies within ASEAN, we will be the leader in achieving a 70% at least RE mix by 2050 for the same year. And by that time, I hope and I aspire as part of the Energy Commission that we'll be part of the ASEAN power grid as well.
No, thanks, Danny. Young Bohoma, Tuan Rafizi, just before I go, I think of energy as the ultimate lifestyle product. You sit here, our audience can hear us, we have air conditioning because of electricity. And as a nation that is developing, we are going to need more and more power. 70% RE, it's an audacious target, but it's a necessary target for just transition. With that sort of paraphrasing some of what we've been discussing earlier, how did we come to a 70% target, and how does that move into that just transition story? Because while also affecting a fundamental shift in our economy.
Well, I think we have to work within a few economic and societal parameters. The first one is to make sure that we insulate ourselves from future energy shocks. We have to realize that part of the fiscal problems that the federal government had to endure in the last few years was because of the high cost of energy raw materials, the coals and the gas that makes up majority of our power generation. We are a nation that is very comfortable with our oil and gas heritage. Sometimes too comfortable that we think the gas will be there forever. If we don't scale up fast enough, there can be a situation within 10 to 15 years that we have to consider importing gas. So one of the main concerns from the government is just not about going into green. It's actually to insulate our future and our society from energy crisis. And from time to time, the government has a projection of what kind of generation capacity that have to be installed in order to meet the energy demands. And it's always up to 20, 30 years in advance, because it does take a lot of time to put all these capacities in place to balance. We are lucky because we do have a high reserve margin. And while it is a cost to the public, it is also an advantage that we should use in order to transition and put more solar, because solar doesn't require renewables. Solar is one big potential because it doesn't require feedstock. And by that, not only that it will insulate the countries from future energy shocks, we hope it also balance the tariff in the future so that it is more representative of the potentials that we have. So all these were taken into account. The 70% target for 2050 was a sweet spot that we think will be able to balance between the possibility and practicality of pushing up the capacity. It takes into account that gas is a transition fuel that we have to maintain to make sure that it's a just transition. It takes into account the multiplying effect of green economy, that you need to have a certain amount of scale to be able to create a sustainable and vibrant, and it also take into account the scale that we need in order to lead in this region. So it's not a number that we pluck from the air. We look at the solar rooftop capacity, about 332 gigawatt in the country, and we work backwards and we map how much that can we do practically in these times. And I think most importantly is a stretch target that can set our ambition. We cannot have an ambition without a stretch target. It's only with a high ambition that it can bring the whole nation together to work, and it's only by then we will get the respect of the investors and our peers in this region. And that's why it's 70%. And I hope I live long enough to see that it happens. But I also hope whatever happens, our nation, everyone will own up to this, because, as I say, it's a good opportunity for us to lead in this one particular area.
I mean, as the actor on stage today, for want of a better term, can we do it before 2050? Possible.
I think the ministers after us will answer that.
Moving along, we touched on the 10 catalytic projects. Ministers, we get capital market investors. I mean, to be blunt, I want everyone in this room to walk out with an investment strategy after we wrap up today. What can we share?
Of course, every time we talk about renewable energy, the focus has always been on electricity, and it's always almost about solar and hydro. But we have a certain capacity and experience to also lead in some other areas. For example, and I've repeated this quite a few times publicly, we built the whole LNG value chain with our partners in the Far East, from the extraction, from the processing of LNG, and then from the storage. Eventually we built the market. Back then in the 80s, LNG market and long-term contract was still nascent. It took a while for us to really benefit from LNG, but we've had the experience of working with our partners to build a total value chain. Now, there is a lot of focus to move to hydrogen, and we are at the same position, or that the world is more or less at the same position that we were in the 1980s. It's still a nascent market. There's a lot of doubters about whether it's doable. There's a lot of technology and cost challenges to transporting hydrogen. There's a lot of skepticism about practical application of hydrogen. But, in my engagement with our counterparts in Japan, in the Far East, they are very serious about it, as they were very serious about LNG about 40, 50 years back. So we have been there, and now we have the first mover advantage from our experience as a top LNG player. that we can now replicate into hydrogen. So that's one area, key focus as well. Building the infrastructure of hydrogen is important, and in the next 1 year, few months, we are looking at how we can divert public investments to create a practical use case for hydrogen fuel. It sounds very ambitious, but I think it is doable. At least I think it's doable. Because we have done things that was considered not doable then in the 80s, you know. So that's one. We also have an advantage when it comes to carbon capture and storage. It's still quite nascent in the world. As the market develops and matures further, more and more countries, and we know especially as it moves closer to 2050, many countries will be rushing to meet their net zero commitments. At that time, you know, at some point in the future, there will be an inflection point where carbon capture, utilization and storage is not only a fancy name, it becomes an economy imperative as more and more economies have to weigh between, you know, the cost of not meeting their net zero commitment and the cost to meet. And so, you know, I foresee in the future, CCUS will be a permanent feature in the global economy. And we have the advantage because we have a lot of geological formation. Petronas and Sarawak government are actually quite advanced. If anything, the government has to catch up with them to make sure that we have the legislation, the rules and the regulation in place. So the hydrogen value chain, CCS, and of course EV has been talked about. EV relates to people better, and with the commitment for the government to make sure the charging infrastructure are in place, because there's always a chicken and egg thing. You cannot have too many EV if you don't have enough charging stations. Now it is a national policy to make sure that charging infrastructure is in place. So I think all these, as you go through one by one, the 10, and what we wanted to be sure, that's why it took us about a few months to get the commitments from all the players. We want to make sure that this is not just announcements. These are basically committed investments, and they are going to happen. What we can do on government side is to expedite as much policy change and as much incentives as possible so that it becomes a national focus and it allows all these 10 projects to tick off per the timeline. And I'm sure that will have a spillover effects to the whole industry, especially not just the energy transition and green industry, it's also to the OGSE industry. Because oil and gas service equipment sector are actually almost identical to the support system that is required for energy transition. And finally, Omar, I think when we do this phase by phase, project by project, because government has to change the way we do things in order to facilitate this, it will move towards a much more open and competitive energy market in this country. And I think as and when it happens, you know, it bodes well for the country, for the investors, and for the market.
I'm just going to park that last comment because that's actually very interesting. I think that's something we need to explore a little bit. But just looking at the 10 catalytic projects, foreign equity restrictions, investors, any policy guidance is available at this point in time? Ministers?
Well, I mean, I think for the flagship projects that's been mentioned, as I think Saudara Rafizi has mentioned, a lot of it comes out after months and months of serious discussion and commitments from the parties. And I think, I mean, maybe Rafizi can comment further, but from our side, you know, for ours, you know, we are quite agnostic towards who wants to come in. We have that, our ambitious agenda in terms of climate change, in terms of net zero, and in terms of energy transition. So how we achieve that. I think it was Deng Xiaoping who said he doesn't care black cat or white cat as long as it can catches the mice, right? So I think we are quite practical and pragmatic when it comes to that. And I think there's no choice but to take that attitude if we are to achieve these goals.
Just to echo what Nick says, we have to acknowledge certain facts about doing this. We have the potentials, and now we have the will to do that. We have some capabilities, but we may not have all. So in that sense, I think we have to be very pragmatic. And looking at the first flagship project that will be, presented today between Khazanah, UEM, Mitramas, it really pulls together an international collaboration. We have a GLC, we have a state government, and also, authorities working on it. We also have a homegrown green energy player who have been in the market for a long time. And it's funded partially as well by international infrastructure investors, I Squared Capital, and it also taps into a green fund internationally. And I was informed that the off-taker includes a global player in PV modules. So that's, I think, the beauty of energy transition. It's precisely because it is at certain level of complexities that for this to happen at the kind of scale that we want to do, it does require the government, the energy player, the investors to be very pragmatic about it, and it will have some sort of international flavor to it. And I would like to see as much international content, investment, collaboration coming to it, because this is what we require to push our economy into the high value content that we've been struggling before. If we keep doing the same thing, or if we keep barricading ourselves, looking inwards, we can't go to the next level unless we work with those people who have the technology and capability to do this. And I hope, and I'm sure, apart from these 10 flagship projects, that's precisely the intention of NETR, to make sure that we have a much higher international technology and investment content from all over the world.
Yeah, but just moving on for the point I put in the parking lot. Key enabler, you mentioned those magic words, transparent pricing model. A key enabler of that would be a single aggregator, one would think?
Otherwise the whole hall will listen to me for one whole afternoon. So
if I can just chip in. So, we already have the concept of a single buyer that was launched many years ago as we, the reforms for our power sector. It's not completely independent yet at this point of time. It's ring fence. And I think, but the idea is to move towards a more liberalized, market-based utility sector. And I think, one of the other commitments that we had is that when we lifted the ban on renewable energy export, we wanted to use also this energy exchange, which we are in the works of putting it to cabinet, the detailed proposals, the discussions we had between Energy Commission and NRECC. So, but in the future, I think, when it becomes more open, because it will require the market will be much more different than what it is today. Then I think, the idea perhaps one day of having an independent single buyer in the electricity sector or in the energy sector will actually be feasible. Okay. But for now, the current approach is still to ring fence it within the whole ecosystem.
I'm sorry, Daniel, please.
Yeah, the concept of single aggregator is much talked about, but what you see, one of the issues, Omar, for example, YB Rafizi aims that hopefully most households, hopefully the majority of households will be getting or will be developing solar, so they will become prosumers. One of the issues with that, of course, is we need to then match the demand and the supply. And we need to do it efficiently in the absence of a market. We don't have a market here. We don't have a merchant market yet. And therefore, there needs to be this construct, which is an aggregator that can do that efficiently. That's the whole point. So it would be under the government's purview, of course, to make sure that the players, essentially all players get a fair deal, both supply and demand side. But it's about efficient allocation, and it's about incentivizing all those small prosumers to also get into the generation game, so that the RE100 companies and also cross-border, which is Singapore, also get gigawatt levels of energy. Now, that is much easier said than done, and that is one of the key roles of an aggregator, to ensure that allocation is done efficiently. And don't forget the delivery. And what I mean by delivery is the grid. There needs to be huge tens, if not maybe even hundreds of billions over that target to 2050 to achieve the delivery of reliable renewable energy. RE is variable, and what I mean by that, there needs to be tremendous amount of battery storage. We unfortunately don't have wind to shore up RE at night. We just don't. So, and obviously there's no sun. So we need to have basically load matching of daytime generation against requirements also in the evening as well, which happens to be a peak load for this country. The peak load happens after work, just before dinner. That's where it's the highest. So these technical requirements and that efficient allocation requires the necessity of an aggregator in the absence of market today. Hopefully when the market develops, as YB Nick mentioned, who knows, a decade from now, it'll be much better. But we need to have NETR today. We need to have the transition right now.
Yep. Clearly, there needs to be a robustness of transmission and the aggregation, as well as storage. Do we envisage we'll be in a position where, say we had 4 contiguous houses, I could sell to you, peer-to-peer, if you like, the empowerment of the consumer or the producer, as my home has I've solar cells on my ceiling, I then sell back to grid, or I bypass, if you like, we net off and we just pay the transmission charge?
Okay, well...
future state.
Sure. I just want to highlight again for all interested participants and stakeholders the issue of subsidy, which YB Rafizi mentioned, and the desire by this government to reduce that subsidy or the burden to the rakyat. YB Rafizi mentioned we want also to be independent of the volatility of fossil fuel prices. So the challenge today, Omar, is that I like to introduce this concept called solar poverty. So solar poverty, which is actually also apparent in all other advanced nations that have put up solar, because solar is essentially the privilege of the rich. Only the rich can afford 30,000, 40,000 installation, even at a terrace house. Notwithstanding financing, well, of course the participant has to pay for the financing anyway. So the problem there is solar will enable that family to obviously monetize the sun, as it were. But it is done at the moment at tariff levels which are subsidized. The NEM rakyat is based on subsidized tariff. In other words, someone out there who's not having solar is paying for it. And that is what solar poverty is. Solar poverty is where the have-nots, the solar have-nots, actually end up subsidizing the solar haves. So that is something the Commission, together with NRCC, must resolve first. So that concept is then called cost reflectiveness. So when you want to have large-scale solar deployment, that equalization must happen first, where there is no cross-subsidy from the poor to the rich. That's perverse, obviously. But that can be achieved because there are demand sources who will pay market prices. And those market prices are much higher because the demand is so high.
You aggregate and you export, and then you
Correct,
can fund
and that's
your
where the
adjustment
aggregator
position.
comes in.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
So that's the architecture.
I mean, just to add on to Omar's questions, that's the discussion we explored with SMW Properties first. One of the key decisions we made in May, and we worded in such a way that is quite general to allow more flexibility in exploring the implementation phase, is this: that government will allow a willing seller, willing buyer, self-contained system for renewable energy generation. And by that, it now, based on that decision, it now allows, for example, a developer like SMW Property, when a developer develops a township, they can offer and package the leasing of the rooftop together with the whole package. So what it means is, because the policy now allows for a self-contained generation, it means that we will allow for such projects to bypass the normal quota, so that they can go and plan the large township and install solar and make sure that the nitty-gritty of not just the cost for installing solar, but also to buy, the RE and then to either use it in their system or sell it to the single market aggregator. It now then makes it palatable for us to see more and more township and commercial townships to be powered by solar, independent of how and when the single market aggregator develops. So, we sequence it in such a way that all this can take place in parallel, because even if we don't have a single market aggregator by then, those townships that want to have a self-contained RE generation, that means that they have to install energy storage as well, just to manage the variability, and suddenly you can end up with township and households that can monetize their rooftops. Of course, once the single market aggregator takes off, it also means that other rooftops, either commercial or domestic rooftops, can now tap and monetize the rooftop, because the idea is you create more retail RE players that go and lease the rooftops, install the solar at their cost, because the economic should make sense, as Danny mentioned just now, because there is a margin of putting the cost for the solar rooftop, and then the tariff will allow some margin that the whole economics will work.
I see our countdown time has gone amber. It'll go red shortly. A general question, Danny, if I may, not about specifics, NTR in your mind, or NETR as we now call it, thank you, with regards to NETR, non-specific, the challenges in making it happen, making it real?
Okay, sure. The biggest challenge by far is basically grid preparation.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about 70%, you are looking at an 11-fold increase in generation plant up in RE alone, 11-fold. However, the current grid only has about 2 or 3 gigawatt left in it. Before, if you put more than that, it will start breaking down, and we will have essentially blackouts across the country. This is not a challenge just for Malaysia. This is a global challenge. And it's not just about batteries, it's about transformers, it's about the transmission lines itself, it's about interconnections as well. When we have surpluses, we want to have bi-directional flow between nations. If we're going to be part of the ASEAN power grid, we must have that anyway. We want to have interconnections with our own or other states within Malaysia, i.e. Sabah, Sarawak in particular, and so on. That, Omar, requires literally hundreds of billions of investment. But therein lies the capital market opportunity. Because as YB Rafizi and YB Nick mentioned, it is actually commercially viable. If you look at the pricing of RE, not just out of Singapore, but there are demands within all those RE 100 companies in Penang, within E&E sector, in Selangor, in Johor, all of them are screaming for RE. And of course Singapore, as I've already mentioned. So the biggest challenge is getting the grid ready, making those investments, and making sure that they are commercially viable.
Thanks, Danny. YB Nick? Non-specific structural
Challenges. Yeah, I mean, I think, as mentioned, I think Danny has covered most of it.
Okay.
But I think, it's a change of mindset as well. For those of us who are involved in, those who are involved in the energy sector, the shift towards more RE, towards a more different market, it's a new paradigm. And as Danny mentioned, it's not a challenge that we face alone in Malaysia. We saw, for example, Vietnam, their plant up in solar was very impressive. But what happened? The grid was not ready for it. Yeah. So, there's always, there are all these considerations that we have to make. But eventually, we know that we have these grand commitments. And we know that we are at the center of ASEAN. All this idea of interconnections, even, when we built Bakun to do the submarine cable, it was not feasible all those years back. But now it makes sense because as we plant up more RE, we need to have more interconnections. That's how it works in Europe and many other regions. So I think we have to be able to imagine something different. And I think we have to me, we have all these announcements that we've made, and having NETR in place now, it actually provides us the opportunity to see some implementable projects and how the pathway to achieve those objectives.
Thank you, YB Nick. Sir?
I suppose the biggest challenge on our part after this, now that you create an expectation, a pathway, we have to take a one whole nation approach to this. So I'm sure the investment community and the green energy player in the country are all fired up and get up and can do their bit. Then the government must do our bit. And the bigger challenge for us is that we need to create the ecosystem. Basically requires policy adjustments, not just in the energy or energy transition. It requires fiscal, rebalancing. It also requires certain politically and socially sensitive policies. For example, how do we treat our energy subsidies? We've done quite well, I think, with the electricity tariff. I know there are pockets of people not happy here and there, but by and large, we've done it. And as we move into the more socially sensitive policy retargeting, subsidy retargeting, like RON 95, diesels, that will be something that I think this administration has to stay on course. Because this is not just about the fiscal consolidation, that is required as a component of the ecosystem for the whole energy transition and uplifting of the economy to happen. We also need to realign that. And of course, we inherit a series of legacy contracts. When we talk about rebalancing our energy generation and power mix in the future, there's a lot of things that we have to manage with the legacy as well. So this is where the politics of it come in. So I hope that we'll deliver our part, the private sector deliver their part, and society understand it enough, and as they feel the benefit of it, only then I think we can pull this off.
YB Nick, YB Rafizi, Danny, thank you on behalf of the audience and myself. You've been generous with your time, more generous with honest answers. So we draw to a close for this session. I'm emceeing. Let us say thank you.